Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to talk about the Rey Lopez, beginning with e4, e5, knight of 3, knight c6, bishop e5 begins the Roy, a6, bishop to a4, knight of 6, castles kingside, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop to b3, castles kingside, and here of course black is threatening to play the marshal, planning on meeting this move pawn to c3 with pawn to d5, going into the marshal counter gambit, which has basically been analyzed to death, and it's basically been analyzed to a draw. So white is trying to avoid this at all costs. Now, the three main choices for the anti-marshal are a4, d4, and pawn to h3, and this video is, of course, going to cover none of these. We are going to be covering this other anti-marshal choice, this move pawn to a3. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So the first question is, why a3? Why not one of these other anti-marshal choices? Why not either a4, d4, or pawn to h3? Well, the main thing is with moves like pawn to h3 and moves like pawn to a4, white's main aim was to kind of get back into some sort of normal Ruy Lopez by forcing black to eventually play a move like d6 and just transpose into something that's either the main line or something very similar to the main line. Especially with the move like pawn to h3, the ambidextrous system, this was basically the idea is, d5 is still no longer playable because, e d5, knight d5. We can take the free pawn as long as we still have the c3 square available for the knight. This is basically the crux of every anti-marshal system. As long as we can develop naturally, you can't quite get away with the gambit quite yet. But the move h3 very recently in the World Championship match between Magnus, Carlsen, and Ian Nepomniachtchi played back in 2021 was being met with this move knight to a5. The idea of which was to sacrifice this pawn on e5 in exchange for the bishop pair, and then eventually black was just going to play pawn to d5 and apparently equalize. And it worked in the World Championship match. So black was equalizing in this position very easily and very freely by sacrificing this pawn on e5 anyway, and then playing d5 anyway, so kind of a la Marshall. This was kind of the same kind of idea. And also the move pawn to a4, which again is an attempt at getting back to similar positions to regular Ruy Lopez's, was being met with this move rook b8 in the World Championship match, with a very similar idea of just basically black eventually playing the move pawn to d5 anyway, and just equalizing at some point. So I guess that would leave this move pawn to d4, but of course that means that we have to pretty much abandon all of the ideas of the regular Ruy Lopez, because of course pawn to d4, it has its own unique type of positions. They're actually a little bit more similar to positions you might see out of an Italian game, with pawns in the center getting exchanged, kind of Max Lang attack-esque. So it's a different structure. It's a structure that you would get more out of an Italian game or more out of a Scotch or something like that. So it's not really the Ruy Lopez type plan. So that's why a3 is kind of interesting, because a3 doesn't allow this move knight to a5, because now the bishop has retreat. We can play bishop to a2. We're also not putting direct pressure on the center. We're not putting direct pressure on the b5 square. So really what we're doing is we're threatening to play some sort of slow building system. It also counters d5, because we still have the c3 square available for the knight. So after pawn to d5 takes, it's totally unsound for black to give up this pawn, because we can still develop the knight to the c3 square. So a3 is a really reasonable anti-marshal system. Now, interestingly enough, the first person I saw play this at the absolute highest levels was Magnus Carlsen himself, that was deploying this back in 2008. And, one of the games that I found really interesting was, of course, this game he played against Lev on Aronian. That game continued bishop to c5, and then Magnus continued with this move pawn to c3. Now, what's interesting to note here, and one of the main reasons that I think that this idea with a3 is maybe a really viable approach to try to play an anti-marshal and just to try to play normal type of Ruy Lopez positions, is because we can of course follow up any black move with a move like d3 and basically just trying to transpose back into the main lines. Now c3 is of course in response to the fact that black has two-stepped his bishop from e7 to c5, so therefore we're basically playing a lot of different variations with the bishop on c5, but we've just thrown in this extra move pawn to a3, which of course shouldn't really hurt us. And that was kind of what Magnus Carlsen was going for in his game against Aronian. So like after d6, he continued with pawn to d4, and then we have bishop to b6, and then he continued with h3, rook e8, and bishop g5, h6, bishop h4. We had e takes d4, c takes d4, and then we had g5. Now what was interesting here is bishop b7, knight c3 should be some sort of advantage white. The game continued g5, bishop back to g3, g4, and there's a lot of wild complications in this game. This was one of the reasons why I kind of liked the idea, because it looked like a lot of stuff was hanging, but apparently a lot of stuff isn't hanging. For example, if knight takes d4, we have bishop d5, which apparently is winning for white. If rook takes e4, we would have rook takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop d5, basically the same kind of idea. Queen e8, queen c2, knight g3, and then queen g6 is completely winning for white as well. So even though it appears like things are hanging, I guess things aren't. Now, in the game, Aronian played pawn to g4. We have this takes, we have bishop takes, and then we actually have a mistake from Carlsen, which Carlsen still ended up winning this game. He played this bishop h4 move, and at some point, white actually ended up with a slight disadvantage, but of course the position is still wildly complicated. He could have played queen c1, which leads to this wild continuation that the computer gives that I still don't fully understand. Because, of course, there's a lot going on here. The knight on c6 is hanging, the pawn on h6 is hanging. There's a ton of stuff going on here. But according to the computer, the best line is after bishop f3. You might be thinking, well, if we can get our material back, we can play pawn captures. No, the computer doesn't want any of that. It wants to play bishop takes h6. And of course, we got a lot of threats here. Queen g6 is on the table, and bishop h4 is on the table, and all this weird stuff. So now bishop to e4, and now bishop h4, which was the move that my instincts were leaning towards, is apparently only equal. Like after bishop h4, knight g4 at queen h5, the computer is giving equality. Again, it's way more complicated than my brain can fully understand. But this is apparently equal, which I guess means it's leading to some sort of perpetual. The correct move is just kind of building the position. Something like knight to c3 leads to a position that is insanely complex beyond anything that I can fully describe. Knight to c3, bishop h7, and then the idea is rook e8, knight to e8, bishop d5, knight d4, bishop h4 now, queen over, and then rook e1, which of course threatens mate in a half a dozen different ways on the spot. Rook e8 followed by something like bishop f6 is a serious threat. So knight f5, forking is the idea, and then we have queen h5, knight to g7, queen f7 check, king h8, bishop a8, knight to h4, bishop back to e4, bishop d4, knight d5, queen g8, queen takes, knight c7 is just incredibly unclear. And again, I don't fully understand all of this. This was all just kind of stockfish analysis. There's like a rook for 2 pieces. There's a couple of pawns here for white. Again, the assessment is just ridiculously unclear. But this was an interesting approach. The Carlsen-Aronian game continued bishop h4, and at some point, black actually had an advantage, but again, the position was wildly complex, and the game actually just ended in a win for Magnus Carlsen, because he was able to navigate those complexities a little bit better than his opponent. Now, all of this being said, the most interesting thing that I find about all of these positions is that I don't have to go into these complications, even beginning with c3 and beginning with d4. If I want to, even against bishop c5, I can just continue with something really sedate. I can play something like pawn to d3, pawn to d6, and then play something, again, really sedate. Something like pawn to h3. And we can transpose into something similar to the main lines. For example, bishop b7, knight c3, h6, knight d5 should be slight edge white. This should be slight advantage white, and white can just continue kind of pressing from here. And this is kind of what I think people need to be going for with the white pieces, are these positions that haven't been theoretically analyzed to death, positions where we clearly have some sort of slight advantage, and we can continue to play for something that hasn't been, worked out all the way to the end game and worked out all the way to a draw. Another direction that this can go is after d6. We have this Grishchuk game that instead of h3 went bishop g5, and this was kind of interesting. It continued h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, bishop g4, c3. So kind of similar, trying to get in this c3 and d4, but doing it a little bit slower. Bishop to b6, knight on b to d2, bishop back to e6, knight f1. Knight h4, knight e3, bishop takes e3, rook takes e3, bishop b3, queen b3, queen d7, and eventually Grishchuk went on to win here with the white pieces. So that's another interesting option, is just playing this move bishop to g5. But again, I'm really leaning towards kind of these slow plans with h3 and d3 against bishop c5, but also against the other moves here. For example, if they just continue slowly, if they play d6, we can continue with pawn to h3. This was actually played in a non-versus Aronian back in Moscow back in 2011. This game continued bishop to b7, then d3, then knight to b8, knight on b to d2, knight on b to d7, knight f1, rook e8, knight e3, h6, bishop to a2, bishop f8, knight h2, knight c5, knight on h to g4. So we can play these slow types of building positions with the white pieces. We can play for a slight advantage, and we can try to play for something here. And that's exactly what Anand did in this game against Aronian, and I'll just show the rest of the game here. After knight g4, queen g4, knight back to e6, he managed to play h4, bishop to c8, h5, c6, knight f5. So we see a lot of this traditional type of getting play in the Ruy Lopez, getting that knight to the f5 square, getting more space on the king side. King h8, bishop e3, d5. We have queen f3, knight to g5, bishop g5, queen g5, knight e3, rook e6, and then he started capturing material here. He played e takes d5, and I think I've actually shown this game before. Black ended up getting a kind of big attack against the white king, but it wasn't quite enough to break through, so actually white just ended up defending nearly perfectly. He defended everything about as perfectly as he could defend it. Bishop to d6 and all this other stuff. And after all the dust had settled, Anand didn't get mated and he ended up material, so Aronian had to resign. There was a lot of weird stuff in the complications there. Like at one point Aronian was okay and Anand missed something too, but basically this is, again, just a very interesting approach to these positions, is to play a3 first, then play h3, and then meet bishop b7 with d3. And we're transposing into these slower, quiet systems where we can just kind of play chess. And that's kind of the idea behind a3, and that's one of the reasons I think, at least at the highest levels, if people want to keep playing the Ruy Lopez, I think that people are gonna, I think we're gonna see a3 a lot more. Just because of this knight a5 move against the ambidextrous system. And because if you analyze those positions to death with the computer, it seems like black is coming out with complete equality without ever having to play much of a chess game. At least with a3 followed by d3 and h3, we are still getting a chess game out of it, and we're getting a position where we can play for some sort of slight advantage with white without the game just ending in theory. So anyways, I hope you found that content interesting. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can play some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.